Chapter 1. Rip Campbell heard the stage driver let out a sharp, short oath, and then the rattling Concord grated to a quick stop, chains rattling, the six matched horses panting. "Hold up," a fat, putty-faced man groaned as he fumbled hastily for his wallet. Rip lifted the flap from the window and peered out, blinking gray eyes in the late afternoon sunshine. The coach had been passing down the east side of Atlas Pass, moving through the timber which grew very thickly along this section of the road. There was a small clearing directly off the road, and the sun slanted down through the tops of the pines, lighting up the spot. It was about 10 yards across. A huge oak tree grew at the edge of the clearing, one branch protruding halfway across, and a man's body swung from this branch, a black mask over the face, and a small white note pinned to the coat lapel. "Damn it," the fat man muttered. "A hanging." Rip stepped out and walked slowly after the stage driver. Back in Frisco, other newspaper men had warned him that the Hollow, the gold mining town across the Sierras, was a literal hell on earth, and that a man with convictions took his life in his hands when he entered therein. That town was just cleaned out by a vigilante committee, Sam Henderson, editor of the Frisco Blade, had told Rip before he left. "Now I hear it's worse than ever. You can dig all the damned gold you want on those claims, but they won't let you bring it out. Jeff Barkley seems to be hanging on," Rip had pointed out. "It'll be an experience." He'd been with the Blade for 2 years reporting local news, but the news these days all came from over the mountains. Jeff Barkley, editor of the Hitch Hollow Tribune, had sent out a plea for assistance. The Hollow was growing, with nearly 5,000 people in the town already and more piling over Atlas Pass every week. Barkley wanted another reporter to help him set up his sheet. "I'd like to go out," Rip said. He had a letter in his pocket now from Jeff Barkley. There had been an exchange of correspondence, neither man having seen the other, and Rip had resigned his position on the Frisco paper for a job with Barkley. He'd been promised a job as assistant editor, and on a growing paper in a growing town that could mean a lot. Walking toward the dead man swinging gently from the oak bough, Rip realized the reports coming out of Hitch Hollow had not been exaggerated. He watched the stage driver climb up on the limb and cut the dead man down. The body collapsed to the ground with a peculiar thud, the limbs giving way as if they'd been made of rubber. The fat man who had come out behind Rip let out a short gasp. He stopped halfway between the clearing and the waiting Concord on the road. "He's a dead one," the stage driver growled, coming down again. He was a short man with tawny red hair and a week's growth of fuzz on his cheeks. Rip watched him bend down and take the slip of paper from the dead man's chest and look at it. He grimaced, face turning pale under the tan, and handed the slip to Rip standing a few feet back. "Them damned hangmen are at it again," the driver said, then gave Rip a quick glance. The newspaper man looked at the sheet. There was a noose crudely drawn on it, and the words, "Hangman of Hitch Hollow" directly below the noose. The stage driver bent down and slipped off the black mask for a second. He was muttering softly in his throat as he walked back to the coach and climbed to the seat. McAdams hesitated, and then climbed up after the driver. He was a taller man than the redhead, smaller in the waist and wider in the shoulders. They went down the road 50 yards before Rip spoke. "Vigilantes?" he asked quietly. The driver sniffed and spat over the side of the lurching vehicle. "I wouldn't know, mister," he said cautiously, giving Rip another side glance. Rip rubbed a hand across his long jaw and stared at the rump of the right-wheeler, amusement flashing briefly in his eyes and then sliding away. He knew that the driver was a little afraid of him now, and the fear had been engendered by this hangman's committee. "That chap deserve hanging?" Rip asked next. They could see evidences of digging along the sides of the gulch as they approached closer to Hitch Hollow. Here and there a miner looked up from his sluice box and waved to the driver. They gave Rip a long stare, some of them rolling tobacco in their jaws as they did so. The driver mused a moment before replying. "Reckon Jeff Barkley had a lot of friends in the holler," he said then, "and a lot of enemies 'cause he wasn't the one to back water." The San Francisco man stiffened. "Jeff Barkley?" he said quickly. "He the man was hanged?" The driver nodded. "Jeff ain't got a twin," he chuckled, "so I reckon it must be him, mister." He flicked the whip at the rump of one of the leaders. "You know him?" Rip took a deep breath. "Never met him," he said truthfully. "We've heard of the Tribune on the coast." They were moving into the main street of Hitch Hollow with the sun dropping down through the slot which was Atlas Pass. The town was completely rimmed in by mountains and dusk came here very swiftly, bringing with it the chill breezes from the slopes. Lights sprang up in the false front houses lining each side of the street. On the outskirts of town they'd passed many tent dwellings, but here the homes were more permanent, some of them 2 stories high. Once the driver yelled to a group of men standing outside a saloon. Jeff Barkley was strung up, mile over the pass, he shouted. "You boys better bring him in." Rip could see the expressions on the faces of these miners. One man had been smoking a cigar, and the tip of it drooped. All of them gave the driver's passenger a close scrutiny, confirming Rip's opinion that the organization calling themselves the Hangmen of Hitch Hollow had not been identified as to members, and that every man regarded the others with suspicion. They passed a half-dozen saloons, and then the big Alhambra gambling house. This building was 2 stories high with a porch along the entire front. Rip saw lights showing from every window, and dozens of men around the various gaming tables. The Alhambra had 4 separate swinging doors, and Rip could look over them from his perch beside the driver. "Pharaoh Frank Casey runs the Alhambra," the driver stated. "Biggest man in town outside of Harris Davis." Rip glanced back, seeing a rider coming up behind the stage. In Frisco, Harris Davis was reputed a millionaire, owning nearly half of the claims in Hitch Hollow, richest minefield west of the Black Hills country. The rider ran his serge skin horse up alongside the driver, and Rip caught a glimpse of a wide, heavy-jawed face, a deep cleft in the chin, and a pair of squinted black eyes. All this he could see as the stage raced through the square patterns of light crossing the road. "You find Jeff Barkley?" the rider called sharply. He was a powerful man in the shoulders, and then Rip saw something he hadn't noticed before. This man wore a 5-pointed silver star on his vest. "The hanging committee got him," the driver stated. "I cut him down, Serge." Serge looked at Rip, face expressionless, then swung the serge skin around abruptly and headed in the opposite direction. "Serge Delano," the driver scowled. "Best damned sheriff this town ever had." "Have many of those hangings?" Rip asked softly, "without benefit of a trial?" This thing revolted him. A self-asserted committee, little more than a lynching party, had taken a man from the town and strung him up. With brazen callousness they'd even signified that they were responsible for it. "The vigilantes started the hanging business," the driver explained gruffly, "and then when they thought they'd cleaned up their business the hangmen of Hitch Holler started in." He added softly, "Now some of them vigilante fellers are on the other end of the rope." "Barkley a vigilante?" Rip asked. The driver pulled his animals up outside the stage station and tossed the reins to an attendant. "Jeff Barkley and Niles Haygood organized the vigilantes 2 years ago," the driver said grimly, "when this town started. Niles was swinging from a tree up on Bald Mountain a week ago. You could see him from the center of Hitch Holler." Rip stepped down into the dust and waited for his bag. He had the letter in his pocket from Jeff Barkley, but without Barkley there was probably no Tribune, and no job. He had the alternative of finding something else to do in this town, or going back to the coast. "Looks like they broke up Jeff's shop," the stage driver was saying. He pointed to a small 1-story building directly across the road from the stage station. The windows had been smashed in. The door was open and Rip could see the overturned press inside. Slowly, he walked across the road and looked in. Books, papers and type were strewn about the room. Benches, chairs and desks had been smashed. Ink bottles thrown against the walls. A sign lay at Rip's feet, and turning it over the toe of his shoe he read the word Tribune painted in black against a white background. "Rather a shame," a man was saying at Rip's shoulder. The San Francisco reporter turned to look into the eyes of a slender, gray-haired man with a thin, jaundiced face and a sharp aquiline nose. "This town have no law?" Rip asked, bitterness coming into his voice. From the few letters Jeff Barkley had written to him he'd come to like the man. Barkley had ambitions. He was enthusiastic about his work, filled with the will to live. The brutal hanging had gone against Rip's grain. "The law," the gray-haired man murmured, "is helpless against what it cannot see." "Permit me," he added. "I am Harris Davis." Rip studied the elderly man more carefully. Davis was well dressed in black Prince Albert coat and white shirt. He wore the old-fashioned shoestring tie. "I presume you are acquainted with Jeff Barkley?" Mr. Davis asked easily. Something clicked inside Rip's mind. He continued to stare into the dim interior of the newspaper shop. Undoubtedly, the stage driver had been the first one to find Barkley's body, and the news could not have gone through the town as swiftly as that. The driver had called to a few men in one of the saloons. He'd spoken to Sheriff Delano, but this had happened less than a minute before. Yet Harris Davis had asked him if he were acquainted with Barkley, signifying that he knew the editor was not with the living. Davis seemed to read his mind, for he said softly, "A passing rider saw the body a half hour before the stage came through. Some of us have learned the facts." Rip nodded. That information may or may not be true, but on the coast Davis had a reputation for honesty. He was too big to be crooked. A man with $1 million worth of gold claims didn't need to stoop into the gutter. "You knew the deceased?" Davis asked again. "I was offered a job on the Tribune," Rip stated. "That job seems to be automatically cancelled." Since learning of the death of Barkley, he had made no plans. "Ah," Davis murmured, "a newspaper man." He added, Hitch Hollow respected Jeff Barkley, but evidently some of its citizens did not appreciate his bluntness. He'd threatened to expose the Hangman Society. "From what I hear," Rip said dryly, "that should have been done a long while back." Davis nodded soberly. "No town can remain a town without proper respect for the law," he said. Rip thought about Serge Delano. The sheriff of Hitch Hollow seemed to be a pretty tough character. "Would you care to have a drink to the memory of our mutual friend?" Harris Davis asked. "Mr. Rip," Rip said slowly. "New editor of the Hitch Hollow Tribune." He saw a daguerreotype lying on the floor of the print shop, face down. Picking it up, he stared at an excellent picture of a young girl. She seemed to be about 16 years of age, flowing brown hair, a well-shaped nose, and a slight smile around the corners of the mouth. "Jeff Barkley had a daughter back east," Davis observed. "The last I heard of her, she was coming out here for a visit. Must be at least 21 by now." Rip placed the picture on the top of the battered old Washington press. Doing so, he noticed some of the type had been set. Barkley had probably been ready to publish his weekly when death called upon him in the form of the Hangman Society of Hitch Hollow. The hand press was wrecked completely, but these few lines of type had been preserved, the marauders probably not thinking them of any interest. "We'll have our drink," Rip said. He was thinking of that type, and making a resolution to examine it more closely at the first opportunity. They walked up the street slowly, Harris Davis in deep thought, hands clasped behind his back. "You believe you can run the Tribune?" he asked once. "I can try," Rip observed. He saw Jeff Barkley's body swinging from the oak limb up near Atlas Pass, and shuddered, thinking that it was not a nice way to die. "I am interested in men's motives," the rich man said suddenly. "I can be of great assistance to a young man like yourself, Mr. Rip. Why do you want to revive the Tribune?" "Every reporter would like his own paper," Rip said. "That all?" Davis asked. "For the present," Rip told him quietly, "that is all." He thought of that picture on the battered hand press in Jeff Barkley's office, and he knew it wasn't. The editor of the Tribune had understood there could be no paper and no peace in Hitch Hollow until the unholy hangmen were destroyed. He'd been engaged in exposing them when they caught up with him. The leadership of this crusade, the dead Jeff Barkley, had passed on to the man who would be his successor. Harris Davis led the way into the gaudy Alhambra gambling house, walking quietly between groups of men and around card tables till he came to the bar. Rip observed the deference with which Hitch Hollow treated the elderly gray-haired man. At the bar, men parted to make room for them, and one of the white-aproned bartenders hurried down, sweeping a special bottle from the shelf and setting 2 glasses beside it. Mr. Davis poured the drinks unhurriedly while Rip studied the big room in the mirror behind the bar. Pharaoh Frank Casey had 7 men working behind this 80-foot-long mahogany bar. A red-carpeted staircase led to the second floor, from where Rip heard the whir of the roulette wheel, and the voice of the keno man calling the numbers in bored tones. A pudgy, smiling man came down the stairs, thin black hair parted in the middle. He stood on the last step from the bottom, hands in his pockets, baby blue eyes taking in the scene with real relish. He seemed a harmless man except for his mouth, had a small stub nose and a round face, but his mouth was a thin slit and it smiled too much. Rip watched him as he walked through the crowd on the floor, stopping a moment to talk to a man, and then coming again toward the bar. Davis turned as this small man came up, nodded politely. "Frank Casey," the rich man murmured. "Meet Rip, the new editor of the Tribune." Pharaoh Frank held out a fat hand, and Rip was surprised at the strength in the man's grip. Plenty of muscle lay in this pudgy man's small body. There was a flicker of interest in the gambler's eyes, then his face was a smiling mask again, revealing nothing. "Any friend of Mr. Davis is a friend of mine," he said cheerily. "We wish you more luck than poor Jeff Barkley had." "It seems," Rip observed, "that Mr. Barkley had no luck at all." Davis held up his glass. "To the Tribune," he stated. Over the top of his glass, Rip caught a glimpse of Pharaoh Frank's eyes. He thought for a moment that he saw amusement written in them, but he could be mistaken. "No man can put down in words," Pharaoh Frank said, "what this town owes to Mr. Davis. He set me up in this place when I had nothing. He's built the only school Hitch Hollow possesses. The men working in his mines receive the highest wages in the diggings." Rip nodded, thinking how strange it was that a philanthropic man should build a school and then support a gambling house. He wondered how many other enterprises Harris Davis had his hand in. From the respect with which the townsmen treated him, many owed him much, and all owed him something. A drunken cowboy at the far end of the bar seemed to be engaged in heated controversy with one of Casey's bouncers. The puncher, a lank, red-haired man with a grinning, freckled face, was insisting that he be permitted to remain at the bar even though his money was gone. The bouncer, a husky chap in a checkered suit which bulged at the shoulders, had him by the arm and was helping him toward the doorway. There was a small grin on the bouncer's broad, bony face, as if he enjoyed his work and wished it would get rougher. Playfully, the cowboy tried to break away and go back to the bar. The bouncer had been waiting for this. He lashed out with his left fist, catching the puncher full in the mouth and splitting his lips. All the good humor left the drunken cowboy. He'd been knocked against the bar a few feet away from where Rip was standing, blood spurting from his mouth. The bouncer went after him again, fists cocked, pleasure written in his small snaky eyes. The cowboy muttered an oath and rushed forward, unsteady on his feet. He missed a wild punch at the bouncer's head, and then was smashed in the mouth again. The bouncer spun him around and rammed a hard fist into the cowboy's stomach, taking all the wind out of him, and knocking him against the bar a second time. Not satisfied with this, the bouncer, knowing he had an audience now, came in again, raining blows into the redhead's ashen face, cutting him badly. Watching the scene, Rip realized how unnecessary all this was. The cowboy could have been persuaded to leave the place without any fuss if he'd been handled rightly. "Take it easy, Gus," a man called worriedly. Pharaoh Frank Casey had turned and was leaning his elbows on the bar, making no move to interfere. Davis held his glass in his right hand. Rip felt the man studying him as he watched this unequal fight. Davis was trying to get his measure for reasons peculiar to himself. Gus, the bouncer, hit the cowboy once more in the stomach, doubling him up. He came in then, fighting close, bringing his knee up viciously. Rip had seen enough. "All right, Gus," he grated, taking 2 steps forward. He was the same height as the bouncer, but not as heavy in the waist. In San Francisco he'd boxed with men who had fought the Benicia boy, had learned some of the rudiments of the pugilistic art. Gus spun around at this new threat, not knowing that Rip had been talking with the owner of the Alhambra. He threw a heavy fist for Rip's face and missed as the San Francisco man pulled back his head. As the bouncer tumbled forward, Rip ripped up with his left and then his right fists, catching Gus both times in the face. As the bouncer straightened up, dumbfounded, Rip rushed into him, raining a half dozen more blows into the man's face, knocking him against one of the card tables. Gus let out a terrific roar and came back, trying to get under Rip's guard and catch him around the waist. The reporter caught him with a right uppercut which nearly tore off his left eyebrow. Gus squealed from the pain and staggered away, clutching at the eye with his left hand. He tried to steady himself against the table, and he stood there uncertainly, still on his feet, but the fight taken out of him by the smooth-shaven, gray-eyed stranger from the coast. "You handle your fists well, Rip," Pharaoh Frank smiled. "Gus is the best bouncer I have." The fight was uncalled for, Rip told him stiffly. "That cowboy didn't come here for trouble." "Lot of men run into it," Frank Casey chuckled, "whether they will or not. Then there are others who go out of their way to find it." He added, "They usually get worse than a beating with fists." "They hang, I suppose," Rip smiled coldly. Pharaoh Frank grinned. "That has happened," he admitted. Rip turned to the cowpuncher and took him by the arm. The man was still sick from the brutal pounding he'd taken in the stomach. Davis had opened his wallet as Rip walked past with the puncher. He slipped a bill into the drunken man's shirt pocket, looked at Rip, and said, "He'll need a room tonight." "Thanks," the reporter said. Many men had seen the action by Harris Davis, and Rip heard them murmur as he walked toward the door with the redhead. Pharaoh Frank strolled after them, touching Rip's arm as they came to one of the 4 doors. "Let there be no ill feeling between us," he said, "because of this. You're a friend of Harris Davis." Rip turned around and looked down at this small pudgy man with a smiling face. "I respect every man," he stated, "until I learn that he is not worthy of that respect." Frank Casey nodded. We are of like sentiments, he observed. Rip went out with the puncher, led him up the street toward a hotel he'd noticed on the way in. A squat heavy-set man rode by on a serge-skin horse and gave Rip a long glance, his face half concealed in the shadows. The man wore a star on his vest, and Rip instinctively knew that this man was the third strongest man in Hitch Hollow. The two strongest he had met a few minutes before. Rip sat on the side of the bed in one of the bedrooms in the big Jefferson house. He watched the cowboy slouched in a chair across the room. The sickness having left the man, he was a little more sober. "Reckon I was takin' it, mister," he mumbled through battered lips. Rip had helped bathe his face with water and he was more presentable now. "You surgied the wrong party," Rip told him. "There's no humor in that, Gus." "I'll put some in him," the redhead vowed, "before I leave this town, friend." He looked at Rip with a strange expression. "I don't know you, mister," he said then. "You didn't have to step in." Rip shrugged. "I like a fight," he observed. "A fair one." That was not it. The redhead rubbed his jaw and nodded. "Any time Rick Slater can give you a lift, mister," he said, "let me know." "All right," Rip smiled. "Better get some sleep." He reached for his hat just as a knock sounded on the door. A small, dried-up little man with a high, stiff collar came into the room. He was dressed in black and he had a legal air around him, confirmed by the small leather bag he slateried with him. "Rip?" he asked. Rip nodded. The little man was very stiff, water blue eyes staring at him from behind thick lensed spectacles. He had a weak chin and a red nose. "I am Irwin Cannon," he said pompously. "Attorney for Jeff Barkley. Mr. Barkley left his last will and testament with me a week before his untimely death." "News travels fast," Rip said. Irwin Cannon sniffled. "I had anticipated Mr. Barkley's death for some time," he commented. He slid a sealed envelope from his briefcase and handed it to the reporter. Rick Slater watched all this from the chair across the room, saying nothing. When Cannon went out, Rip tore open the envelope and read the brief note. It was addressed to himself, and in the event of the writer's sudden death, all property owned by the Hitch Hollow Tribune should be passed on to you, if you would assume the editorship of the paper. Rip sailed, thinking of the battered shop. There would be very little that he could salvage out of that wreck. "Good news?" Rick Slater asked. "I could be weaving my own noose," Rip said dryly. "Time will tell." He went out on the street again and walked toward the Tribune shop, remembering to purchase a few candles before he went in. Setting 2 lighted candles on a broken chair, he tacked a few old copies of the Tribune across the windows and then managed to close the door. Carefully, he examined the battered press, finding only that small section of type which was not broken up. He slid it out, inked it, and then pressed a square of white paper to the surface. The words came out, blurred, but readable. Rip slateried the paper to the candle and studied it. 3 men lead this devilish organization, Jeff Barkley had written. Their names are Sheriff Serge Delano, Pharaoh Frank Casey, and Dash. Rip stared at the third name. A 6-gun cracked outside, the slug ripping through a corner of the paper across the nearest window, grazing Rip's cheek, and smashing into the opposite wall of the room. He leapt for the door and threw it open. Then, realizing his helplessness, being unarmed, he flattened against the wall, hearing a man's footsteps on the boards outside. He drew back his fist and was prepared to smash it into the face of the intruder when Serge Delano stepped into the dim light, gun in hand. "I heard a shot," the sheriff rasped. "Anybody hit?" "I'm alive," Rip observed. He stared at the heavy Navy Colt in Delano's big hand, wondering how many cartridges were still in the cylinders. "Prowling around here," Delano said next, "you're liable to get into trouble, friend. This ain't your property." Silently, Rip handed him the letter Jeff Barkley had written before he died. There was nothing in it of a suspicious nature. Possibly at the time the editor of the Tribune had written it, he hadn't proof of the ringleaders of the Hangman's Society. Rip still had in his hand the slip of paper on which he'd printed that single statement of the last editorial written by Jeff Barkley. Folding the slip carefully, he placed it in his pocket. Looking up, then, he saw Serge Delano's beady black eyes staring at him over the letter. "Kind of a risky job," the sheriff observed, seeing what Jeff got. "I'll expect the cooperation of the law," Rip said softly. "You'll get all the damned cooperation everybody else gets in this town," Delano rasped, sensing a slight. "How many men did the hangman murder the past 6 months?" Rip asked him, "and why aren't they exposed?" "We're on their trail," the sheriff growled. It'll come soon enough. How did they get in here? Rip asked next, in the center of town without being seen and stopped? Serge Delano's jaw protruded. You're asking a damned lot of questions for a man's only been in this town an hour, he stated. The hangman broke in last night when I was over in Morgantown. They smashed Jeff's shop and took him along with them. Nobody recognized? Rip wanted to know. They wear masks when they work, Delano snapped. Which suggests, Rip told him, that they're known in this town. Sheriff Delano laughed raucously. You point them out to me, mister, he chuckled, and I'll get them. That might happen, Rip smiled, sooner than you think. Sheriff. Delano gave him a long, searching stare, and then went out. Rip waited till he heard the man's footsteps die away, then, taking the slip of paper from his pocket, he studied it again and held it over the candle flame. After that he broke up the piece of type from which it had been printed, destroying evidence that the hangmen were known. He was sure Jeff Barkley had intended to print that evidence also along with his accusation, but the hangman had reached him a day too soon. Rummaging around in the piles of papers and letters on the floor, Rip picked up a small sheet which had caught his eye. It was a replica of the sheet which had been pinned to the dead Barkley's chest, a small noose, crudely drawn, but this one had Barkley's name written on it. The slip had probably been given to the man before he died, forewarning him, but Barkley had ignored it. Rip stared again at the picture of the girl, thinking what a shock T would be when he arrived in town to learn that her father had been hanged. Rick was sleeping soundly when Rip returned to the hotel. In the morning he was gone when Rip awoke, but he came in while the reporter was shaving, a small grin on his face and a cut on his cheek. His knuckles were bleeding and he waited till Rip finished before washing them in the basin. Had a little run-in with a friend, the red-headed puncher smiled. Gus? Rip asked softly. It could be Gus, Slater murmured. He sat down on the chair and studied the tall man carefully. Heard a little talk about you, mister, he said. I'm thinking you're gonna need friends in this town. All men need friends, Rip stated. You're sarging a tough outfit, Slater said. I hear the boys that got Barkley will be looking for you if you try to run that paper. I'm running it, Rip said. Slater grinned. I was figuring on leaving this town, he said softly. Reckon I'll stay around now for the fireworks. You might be putting your neck into a noose, Rip observed. Think it over. You didn't do much thinking last night, Slater said, when you busted into that Gus chap. Rip made the rounds that morning, learning that there was another hand press stored in a warehouse in Morgantown. The press had been shipped over the past months before by a certain Dobbs Hartley, a newspaper man. Hartley had died in a drunken shooting fight and the press had never been used. Rip took a good look at it, made his bid, and then had the machine brought into Hitch Hollow by a bull train. The press came in at dusk that night and a crowd of men stood outside the Alhambra gambling house watching it. Pharaoh Frank Casey ambled over and stood in the door as the bull whackers unloaded the heavy equipment. Rip and Rick Slater had cleaned out the shop and were ready to do business. You work fast, Rip, Casey grinned. Rip smiled. I expect to have a paper out in 3 days, he stated. This town will be interested in seeing what you have to say, the gambler told him. I hope, Rip said, they are not disappointed. This man, he knew, and Delano, were involved in the Hangman's Society. But there was no proof and he could make no statements in his paper until there was evidence. The late stage moved past them, and Rip caught a glimpse of a woman's face in the window. The face was familiar. He heard the lawyer Cannon say, that looks like Jeff Barkley's daughter. The crowd around the entrance to the shop watched the stage wheel into the station. It'll be your job, Cannon said, to meet her. Rip grimaced. He was preparing to cross the road when the girl, after having asked a question of the stage driver, started over herself. The bullwhackers had just finished their job and Rip paid them off. The crowd watched curiously as Jeff Barkley's daughter walked to the door. Looking at her pale face, Rip realized she'd already heard the news, possibly from the stage driver, or in Morgantown through which the stage had just come. You are the new editor? She asked quietly. Rip nodded. This was an older girl than the one on the picture, and a girl with bitterness in her heart which reflected in a pair of violet blue eyes. Come inside, Rip told her. Rick Slater scratched his red hair as they entered, looked at Rip, and then left. Who did it? The girl asked slowly. Rip had offered her a chair but she stood in front of him, reaching to his shoulders, figure stiff as a ramrod. There was no sign of breaking in this girl, and Rip warmed to her immediately. He'd anticipated a weeping scene from this Eastern girl, but she had fooled him. "We don't know as yet," the reporter explained. "I arrived in Hitch Hollow last night. Your father had written to me in San Francisco." Briefly, he told her of the exchange of letters. "Your father was influential on a vigilante committee which cleaned out this town a while back," he explained. "Evidently, they didn't get the ringleaders, and these men have organized again to destroy their persecutors." "They are not known?" the girl asked quietly. "Not for certain," Rip said. "I feel that there is something bigger behind this syndicate than mere vengeance." "You intend to track them down?" Miss Barkley asked. "I do," Rip acknowledged. "Then I should like to help you," the girl put in simply. "I could help you in the office." "You have nothing back east?" Rip asked. "I left everything," Miss Barkley explained. "I had intended to live here with father." "I'm very sorry," Rip said. "No man could deny you the right to take part in this fight if you feel you ought to." Rick Slater came in after the girl had gone to the hotel. The tall puncher sat on a box of type and looked at the floor. "You Slatery a gun, Rip?" he asked finally. "No," Rip told him. "I'll get you one," Slater smiled. "Those bullwhackers are making bets now that they have to cart this stuff back in less than a month. In this town," Rip grinned, "they'll find few takers." He had his first sheet on the streets of Hitch Hollow in 4 days, and the paper Slateried a half-page account of the murder of Jeff Barkley. Rip had taken pains to get all the facts as there had been witnesses to the smashing of the shop, and the abduction of the editor. There was a strong demand in the editorial that the hangmen should be made to pay for their crimes at the earliest moment. He hinted that if Sheriff Delano could not maintain order in Hitch Hollow that another man be given the position. Delano appeared at the door 20 minutes after Slater had deposited a batch of papers at the Alhambra. The sheriff Slateried a copy of the Tribune in his pocket, and his face was red under the tan. "You after my job, friend?" he demanded when Rip came over to the desk. "I'm after the thieves and murderers," Rip smiled, "who gang up on innocent men. I presume you're not one of them." "You're asking for trouble," Delano scowled. "I was elected sheriff of this county." "If the hangmen are not broken up before the next election," Rip said suavely, "I'm fighting tooth and nail to see that you don't get re-elected." "I'll remember you at election time," Delano grated. "Nobody asked you to come to this town, Sergio." "I'm here," Rip smiled, "and I'm here to stay." "Unless a bullet puts you down," Delano told him grimly. He was walking toward the door when Rip murmured, "Or a noose, Serge?" The sheriff of Hitch Hollow spun around quickly, fear slipping into his dark eyes for a brief moment. Then it was gone, and Serge Delano scowled. "If you rate a noose, friend, maybe you'll get that." Harris Davis met Rip outside of the Alhambra house that night, a smile on his face. He held out his hand and shook Rip's warmly. "Congratulations on that editorial," the rich man said. "It equals anything Barkley could do. Any time you may need a loan to expand your paper, or you are looking for a new location, see me." "I will," Rip said. "A fine man," Rick Slater murmured when the rich man passed on. "Yes," Rip said. He went into the Alhambra house, feeling the bulge at his right side. Slater had come in that afternoon with a small Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver, insisting that Rip Slatery it with him. The lean puncher always had his own heavy Colt 6-gun strapped at his right side. "You'll never know when they're going to make a play," Farr pointed out, "and I hope to be in it, but maybe I won't." Casey stood at the end of his bar, shoulders bent over the Tribune as Rip came in. The huge pile of papers Slater had deposited on the bar were practically gone. Pharaoh Frank smiled as Rip came toward him. "Have a drink on the house, Rip," he said. "I like your style." "The style," Rip observed, "is not as important in this town as the contest." "True," Casey admitted. "We all regret the crimes of the hangman. Yet no one does anything," Rip stated blandly. "Why hasn't a vigilante committee been organized here?" "Maybe," Pharaoh Frank told him, "they remember what happened to the last one." "There'll come a day," Rip said, "when they'll forget." Pharaoh Frank's eyes lifted. "May we both live to see that day, Rip," he smiled. Rip was smiling to himself as he went out into the night again with Rick Slater at his side. "That man," Slater growled, "I don't like. Give me a chap smiles less." He was making a cigarette on the steps when a shot sounded from within the building. Quickly, Slater jumped to the side of the door, pushing Rip toward the other end of the porch. A man burst through the second swinging door, gun in hand. He was a small man with short legs and a wide-brimmed sombrero pulled over his eyes. Rip caught a glimpse of a slatered, wolfish face and slanted eyes. The stranger raced for a sorrel horse standing at the end of the hitching rack. Swinging into the saddle, he whirled the gun, pointing it directly at Rip standing in the shadows. The reporter leapt back and fumbled for the Smith & Wesson inside his coat, knowing that he'd never get it out in time. A gun cracked from the other end of the porch and the man in the saddle cringed, the muzzle of his gun drooping. The sorrel horse jumped at the sound, unseating the rider and tumbling him into the dust. Gun in hand, Rick Slater came down the steps with Rip after him. The stranger writhed a few times, blood staining his shirt front where Slater's bullet had gone through. Rip picked up the gun which had slipped from the man's hands. It was a Remington with a pearl handle. The crowd surged out through the doors, staring at the two living men and the one dead one. Then Pharaoh Frank pushed his way through easily, hands in his pockets. "You all right, Rip?" he asked. "This chap broke into one of the poker rooms and got off with a couple of $100. I reckon he thought you were trying to stop him." Rip didn't say anything, but Rick Slater smiled openly. "Kind of had eyes in the back of his head," the red-haired man commented. Rip touched Slater's arm and they walked down the street. "Anybody know this man?" Pharaoh Frank was asking. A serge skin horse plunged up the center of the street, and Rick Slater chuckled. "Someday that man is going to come on time." "That day," Rip observed, "he'll lose his job." Slater shook his head. "You were set up, Rip," he said. "Those boys are after your hide and they'll never stop till they have it." "Glad you were along," the reporter smiled. "I never did get that gun out of my belt." "Keep it," Slater said, "where it's more handy. I'm thinking you'll be needing it from now on." Passing on the opposite side of the street they saw a light burning in the office of the Tribune. "They're in," Rick Slater muttered. Rip slipped the gun from his belt and ran across the street, Slater at his side. Grasping the doorknob, he pushed in the door, leveling the gun on the nearest object. Elsa Barkley was sitting on the floor near one of the big file cases, going through some of her father's correspondence which Rip had salvaged. The reporter saw the tears in her eyes. Slater slid off his hat and backed toward the door awkwardly. Rip put away the gun. "Sorry to frighten you," he explained. "We saw the light." The girl nodded. "I suppose they'll come for you, too, Mr. Rip." "I expect to be waiting," Rip told her. He looked at the old letters, seeing one in his own handwriting. "My father was a fine man," Miss Barkley half sobbed. "I never got to know him well. I was in school and he always had his newspaper. That was his life, here and in other towns." Rip helped her from the floor. "I think you'd better go back to the hotel," he said quietly. This was the first time he'd seen her lose control of herself, and he liked her all the more for it. Slater waited outside while Rip walked across to the hotel. When the reporter came back, the red-headed man said, "What's next?" "Them hombres made the first move and I'm thinking we should make the next." Rip grinned. "We'll have a talk with the lawyer, Cannon," he said, "tonight." They found Irwin Cannon in his office, a dim lamp over his desk. He stood up when they came in, the light playing on his cavernous face. "Mind answering a few questions, Mr. Cannon?" Rip asked him. "If they're pertinent," Cannon smiled. "Who will the hangman go after next?" Rip wanted to know. Irwin Cannon shrugged. "A hard question," he murmured. "Who else was on that vigilante committee?" Rip asked him. "The ringleaders?" The little lawyer sat down at his desk again. "They got Jeff Barkley," he said, "and they hanged Niles Haygood. George Bryan was shot over in Morgantown 2 months ago, but it can't be proven the hangmen were behind that." "Who else?" Rip persisted. Irwin Cannon smiled and toyed with a pencil. "You're on the wrong track, young man," he explained. "Leroy Banks and Big Bill Edson were hanged by the hangman less than a month ago. Neither of those chaps were in this town when the vigilantes were running loose." Rip stared. He looked at Rick Slater. "Ever stop to think why the vigilantes were organized?" Cannon asked softly. "That's your answer." "You know it," Rip urged. "You were here." "Barkley knew it," Cannon said. "Niles Haygood knew it. Bryan knew it. Every time a miner struck it rich up along the gulch he was murdered and somebody was ready to file second claim. Leroy Banks and Bill Edson were supposed to have the richest diggings in the hollow. Who has them now?" "Harris Davis," Rip guessed grimly. "No," Cannon said. A chap named Lewis in Morgantown. He was looking at Rip queerly. Even Slater had turned to stare at his friend. I thought Davis owned most of the rich claims up here, Rip said evenly. Most, Cannon explained. Not all. He started to pace the room. This is the way I've figured it, he said. Jeff Barkley and the vigilantes broke up the combination of men who were murdering the miners with the richest stakes and grabbing their claims. Jeff and the boys hanged a half dozen of the bunch, but the big fish got away. They're back now, getting the ringleaders of the vigilantes first so they won't start again, and then moving in on the miners. Who has the best stake in Hitch Hollow now? Rip asked. Jack Ross, Cannon said quietly. He found a white paper tacked on his door this afternoon. It had a new straw on it and his name below. Rip stood up. What is Jack doing? He asked. Taking the morning stage over the pass, Cannon said. He's scared stiff. But he doesn't want to lose his claim. He figures if he stays away for a few months the threat will pass over. We'll see, Ross, Rip stated. Cannon gave him instructions how to reach Ross's cabin at the end of the hollow. Slater had his own horse stabled at Moore's, and Rip rented a horse for the occasion. They were outside Jack Ross's place in 20 minutes. A light shone under the crack of the door. Rip called loudly, Ross. There was a muttered oath, and then a rifle barrel was poked through a chink in the walls. I'm killing the first damned man comes near, Ross roared. Rip grinned. I'm Rip of the Tribune, he said. We want to talk. Ross hesitated a moment. Light, he said then. The two men slid out of the saddles and Ross slid a bolt from the door, opening it cautiously. I hear you got a note from the hangman, Rip said as he went in. They ain't getting me, the Irishman rasped. He was a blocky man with sandy hair, curled at the top. He had a wart on his chin and huge hairy hands. You can't run, Rip said slowly. They'll get you before you leave the country, or they'll get you when you come back. Ross slumped down on a box, mouth drooping. I'll take some of them damned murderers with me, he grated. One man can't do anything, Rip observed. We'll have to stick together, Jack. Ross looked up quickly. Vigilantes? He asked eagerly. This town's been waiting for a man with enough nerve. Call it that, Rip said. We're breaking up the hangman. Outside they heard horsemen coming up the road, and then leaving the road to climb the slope toward O'Doyle's cabin. It's them. The Irish miner whispered hoarsely. It's too late, Rip. Rick Slater slid the six-gun from the holster and stepped toward the door. Ross dived for a corner of the room, knocked aside a few boxes and then lifted a board. Cold air rushed into the room from this opening. I had this ready, the Irishman muttered, for a long time. Get out, Rip said softly, nodding to Slater. You stay here, Jack, and talk to them. We'll open up from the side. Ross's eyes were shining. If we can hold 'em off for a while, he muttered, I have a lot of friends in these diggings. They'll come running when they hear the shots. Slater slid through the hole and then Rip went after him. They heard the horsemen stop in front of the cabin, saddles creaking. The horses stamped restlessly, and then a man called in a gruff voice, Ross. Rip touched Slater's arm and they circled the cabin, keeping a dozen yards away from it. Rip could make out the dark shapes gathered in front of the Irishman's door. There were 6 or 8 of them. The night was dark with no moon and the cold night air sweeping down from the circle of mountains around the hollow. Ross, one of them called again. His voice was husky. You can go to hell, Ross shouted. Break it in, another man murmured. Rip listened carefully, trying to identify the second voice, knowing he'd heard that man speak before. Rick Slater, moving at Rip's side, suddenly stumbled over a large tin can. As he went down, he grabbed Rip's arm and pulled him down also. 2 guns exploded in the night, the slugs passing harmlessly over the heads of the men on the ground. Slater swore and shot at one of the flares. Rip heard a man groan as a bullet slapped into him. He squeezed the trigger of his own gun, feeling it surge gently against the palm of his hand. Another man cried out sharply with pain. Inside the cabin Jack Ross let out a shrill whoop and then his rifle cracked. Get them, the Irishman roared. Get out, a man called sharply. Rip heard saddles creak again and then the slap of horses' hoofs on the road. Across on the other slope lights were beginning to shine in the cabins. Ross, a man shouted. Jack Ross flung open the door of his cabin and took a parting shot at the fleeing horseman. One rider was on the ground. Rip could see him lying in the patch of light at Ross's feet. We kind of broke up this lynching party, Slater chuckled. We might have had more if my big feet didn't get in the way. Ross bent down over the still body on the ground. The man had a mask over his face and Ross ripped it off. He stood up, face pale. Damn it. He muttered. This is Ben Gaynor. I figured he was a friend of mine. Rip looked down at the dead man. There was a small hole just below his right cheekbone, and very little blood. This town will learn soon enough, Rip observed, that many men who were considered friends were not. Rip turned to Ross. Some of you boys ought to hole up together, he advised, for your own protection. I'm sticking in the hollow, Ross growled. Let me know when we're starting after these snakes. First, Rip told him softly, we have to make sure who the snakes are. They rode back to town easily, and turning into the main street saw a rider coming toward them. Rip pulled up and waited. The horse was a Surge Skin, and the rider was Sheriff Serge Delano. I heard shots at the end of the hollow, Delano growled. You boys come from that way? The Surge Skin was nervous and it sidled around, coming up close to Rip's dapple gray. The reporter reached out and touched the flank of the animal. It was wet with perspiration. Delano leapt forward and slapped his hand away. He didn't speak for a moment, and when he did his voice was very cold. I don't like a prying man, Rip, he said. You were riding that animal pretty hard, Rip said softly. I'm wondering which way you came, Sheriff. Serge Delano swung the Surge Skin around and sent it up the road without another word. Voice sounded kind of familiar, Slater drawled. I'd know for sure if I could hear it behind a mask. You see what we're up against? Rip asked quietly. I got an idea, Slater said. That's only half of it, Rip added. This town will blow sky high when it knows the rest. Chapter 2. In the morning he met Elsa Barkley coming out of the hotel and they walked to the print shop together. There was a small white notice tacked on the front door and Rip reached up, tore it down and stuck it in his pocket. I'd like to see it, the girl told him. Rip grinned and inserted the key in the lock. Not important, he told her. Some chaps want to see me. I'd like to see it, Elsa Barkley repeated. They were inside the shop and Rip closed the door. The girl was holding out her hand. Reluctantly, Rip took the paper from his pocket and handed it to her. It was a square sheet, about 4 inches each way, with a noose drawn on it, and a name beneath the noose. The name was Rip Campbell. The girl sat down in a chair, the tears coming into her eyes. I've been expecting this, the reporter smiled, but I have a lot of friends in Hitch Hollow. And a lot of enemies, Elsa whispered. I'm afraid they are the stronger. We'll see, Rip told her. He sat down at the desk and began to write. In another half hour he began to set up type, Elsa Barkley watching him quietly. The paper isn't due for a few days, she said. This is not the paper, Rip smiled. He waited till Rick Slater came in, and then they ran off a few dozen copies of the notice he'd written. Slater stared at the first one off the press, holding it up to the air. The ink was still wet. The red-headed puncher looked at Rip and grinned. You talk here, he murmured, as if you know a hell of a lot more than anybody else in this town about them hangmen. Maybe, Rip observed, I do. He'd written a notice, announcing a mass meeting of every Hitch Hollow miner to be held that night in front of the Alhambra gambling house. In the notice he stated that he had the names of the ringleaders and would reveal them in his talk. I reckon, Slater said, I know one of them, Rip. You know the rest? I'm not sure, the reporter said. Slater scratched his head. What in hell you going to tell them? Rip smiled. They're not sure either, he explained, just how much I know. They'll have to stop me before I talk tonight, because they can't take that much of a risk. Rick Slater was grinning. That means they'll have to come out in the open, he stated, where we can knock 'em off. Rip nodded. They'll have to come out before dusk tonight, he stated. You ride up to the end of the hollow and bring back Ross and a dozen men. Have them ride into town singly so the hangman won't suspect anything. Make sure every man is armed and keep them near the office. At the first sign of trouble try to take a few prisoners. You figure we can make 'em tell who the others are? Slater asked. We can try, Rip said grimly. This Lewis from Morgantown one of 'em? Slater asked curiously. You'll know tonight, Rip grinned. Start writing. He waited till Slater had left and then he took the stack of notices and walked into the street, Elsa Barkley watching him from the door. Nail and hammer in hand, he walked across to the Alhambra gambling house and tacked the first notice on one of the pillars. The sound of the hammer drew men toward the porch. Rip heard them coming up. The Alhambra was empty at this early morning hour, but Pharaoh Frank Casey ambled out of the gloomy interior, hands in his pockets. Rip nodded to him and then walked down the street to the hotel. A small crowd gathered around the notice, and Rip watched them out of the corner of his eye as they read the statement. He tacked one notice outside the hotel, another on the Hitch Hollow Bank building, and several more at various spots on the main street. Coming back toward the Alhambra, Pharaoh Frank smiled at him. Serge Delano came out of his office, hastily crossing the street. He pushed aside a few men and glared at the notice. Catching up with Rip in a few quick strides, he caught him by the arm and spun him around. "You're starting another one of those damned meddling vigilante committees," he growled. "I'm the law in this town, Rip." "You're the law," Rip told him softly, "until the sun goes down tonight, Delano. Remember that." He walked away, leaving the squat sheriff staring after him uncertainly. Pharaoh Frank Casey had heard the remark and was lighting a cigar. Tacking a notice on the wall of Moore's stable down the street, Rip saw Delago go up the steps, walk past Casey and enter the saloon. Casey followed a few moments later. Harris Davis came into the office of the Tribune early that afternoon, his face solemn. "I want to assure you, young man," he said earnestly, "that I shall do everything possible to assist you in this case. I stood behind Jeff Barkley on the other vigilante committee. I only regret that I'm too old to slatery a gun in your posse." "We appreciate your offer of help," Rip said. When Davis went out, Rip walked to the window. The old man was crossing the street, walking stiffly, nodding to people, a kindly smile on his face. Rick Slater rode leisurely past the old man, going toward Moore's stable. A few minutes later, Rip saw Jack Ross ride in on a sorrel horse. The Irishman hitched the animal outside the 49er saloon and went inside. He came out in 5 minutes, wiping his mouth with the back of his red flannel shirt. "What will happen?" Elsa Barkley asked at Rip's side. "I don't know," the reporter confessed. "I'm marking time." At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, he went down to the claim office and spent an hour searching the books. Coming out, he saw Rick Slater lounging outside the Deuce's Wild Saloon. Slater looked at him and flipped a cigarette into the street. Rip walked down along the main street. An occasional rider, moving through, stopped to read his notice, and then rode on. Before nightfall, every miner in the hollow would have the news. It was hot and the sun was moving down toward Atlas Pass when Rip came down the street. The light was directly in his eyes and he did not see Pharaoh Frank Casey standing on his porch until he was nearly opposite the man. "Have a drink," Casey invited, "to success tonight." Rip could see past the man, and under the batwing doors. Several men were ranged along the bar. Jack Ross was standing at the corner near the Wells Fargo building. "This town's all behind you," Pharaoh Frank grinned. Rip went up the steps and pushed through the door. A man at the bar turned to look at him and then bellied up against the wood again. Amos Quinn, the town drunk, walked stiffly across the floor and Frank Casey snapped at him. "Get out." Quinn blinked a pair of watery blue eyes. He was a small, thin man with a hatchet face and a bulbous red nose. "Get out," Casey said again, and this was the first intimation Rip had of impending danger. It was hidden in the tone of voice Pharaoh Frank used. He'd never spoken that way before. "Bad for the trade," Casey stated when Quinn lurched out the first door to the right. Rip studied the 4 men at the bar. With the exception of these 4, the place was empty, the hour being too early for the regular games. One bartender was behind the mahogany bar and he ambled toward them when Casey wagged a finger. He gave Rip a sharp glance. They were standing at the end of the bar out of range of the other men. Casey poured 2 drinks, set the bottle down, and then very suddenly stepped back a few feet. The door at the end of the bar opened and Serge Delano stood there, a 6-gun in his hand, the muzzle pointed at Rip's chest. The distance was 10 feet. "All right," Delano rasped. "Come easy, friend." The bartender poured the 2 drinks into the mouth of the bottle. Rip turned to look at the 4 men. One of them was walking up on him, a gun in his hand. The other 3 were coming behind the first fellow. "Walk in here," Delano whispered. "I ain't talking for fun, friend." Rip looked at Pharaoh Frank Casey. "Very clever," he observed. The man with the gun, a sharp-faced chap with slate-gray eyes and a livid scar running down his chin from the right side of his mouth, shoved his gun into the small of Rip's back and pushed hard. He slid his hand inside the reporter's coat and took out the little Smith & Wesson. "Game's up," Pharaoh Frank chuckled. "You lived your day, Rip." Delano stepped to the side as Rip walked into the room. As the door closed, the sheriff suddenly raised his six-gun, slashed the barrel against the side of Rip's head. Rip had seen it coming and tried to step aside, but the man behind him had slashed also, and this gun knocked him to his knees. Something hit him again on the other side of the head and the room began to swim. He tried to yell to warn the men outside, but no sound emerged from his mouth. He could hear the door close and the bolt slide shut. Then Frank Casey's voice. "Don't kill him yet, Serge." Chapter 3. He awoke with the smell of hay in his nostrils and something tickling his nose. It was very difficult to breathe because there was a gag in his mouth. His hands and ankles were tied tightly and he'd been dropped in a hay loft. There was a window up here, musty with spider webs, but it gave sufficient light. Down below he could hear voices. He was in a barn, and he surmised the barn was in the rear of the Alhambra gambling house. Casey and Delano had carried him here rather than risking taking him out of town in broad daylight. Rip rolled around and managed to sit up. He felt the blood on his hands where the cord had cut into his wrists. He strained several times to loosen them and then gave it up. From the way the sun slanted in through the single loft window he figured that little time had elapsed since he'd gone into the saloon. Rick Slater and Ross wouldn't be worrying for a while. He was sitting about 5 feet from the edge of the loft. Several old beams crossed the opening in front of him. There was a drop of about 10 or 12 feet to the stable floor below. Rip studied these beams and the sight of a new rope tied to one of them sent a chill through him. Leaning forward slightly he could see a noose dangling from the end of this rope. The barn door was closed, and a heavy beam between the slots. 2 men sat on barrels near the door, talking in low tones. One of them was the man with the scar Rip had seen in the saloon. The other man he didn't recognize. The reporter edged back again. He tugged at the cords till the blood flowed freely. The man who had tied him had done a good job. Lying on his back in the hay again, he looked up at the window above him. It was ironic that the hangman could murder him within the town limits and no one know anything about it. A breeze had started to spring up as the afternoon waned, and it rattled the window panes gently. Looking up at them, Rip could see that one of the panes was cracked and a small piece an inch or so across had fallen out. He studied this window a moment and then started to roll toward it. Lying on the hay he made no sound as he backed up to the window and began to feel with his fingers on the floor. That small piece of glass may have dropped to the ground outside, or it may have dropped to the floor in the loft. His fingers closed on a sliver of glass. The piece from the pane had broken into even smaller pieces, but the edges were razor sharp. Carefully, Rip rubbed the sliver of glass against the cords on his wrist. He cut one part and then another. With a tug he loosened the remainder of the cords and cast them off. A man was calling softly from outside the barn door, and Rip heard the beam being lifted. Hastily, he cut the cords around his ankles and ripped off the gag. He had to rub his hands and wrists for a few moments until the circulation came back. Pharaoh Frank Casey had come into the barn and was talking to the 2 guards. "We're to string him up here," the gambler murmured, "and then take him tonight and hang him up on the mountain where we put Niles Haygood. The whole town will be able to see him in the morning." Rip stood up silently. He looked out the loft window. There was a small shed roof directly below, and then a drop of 8 feet to the ground. This would let him into a small stable yard behind the Alhambra. An alley ran from here out to the main street. "Bring him down," Casey said. "We'll get it over with." Rip heard a man's boot on the ladder leading to the loft. Lifting his own boot he kicked through the glass of the window, driving in the rotten wood holding the panes. Down below a man yelled sharply, and Rip slid through the opening to the shed roof. Running to the edge, he was prepared to slip over the side when a man stepped out of the rear door of the Alhambra. It was Serge Delano, and he had his gun in hand. Rip paused, knowing that up here he was a beautiful target. There was utterly no protection and he had no gun to fire back. "Hold still," Delano called softly. "It'll be easier." He was lifting the gun when Rick Slater raced down the alley from the street. Rip yelled loudly and Slater whirled, shooting wildly. Serge Delano had spun around and was taking aim when a man broke through the door behind him, knocking him forward. It was Jack Ross, the miner. Delano recovered himself and sent one shot at Rick Slater. The red-headed man's gun cracked twice and Serge Delano went down on his knees. Rip heard other men running down the alley, and then Frank Casey calling. "Get out!" The reporter slid off the roof. Slater was standing very still, clutching his left shoulder with his arm. He seemed ready to go down, but he managed to grin as Rip raced forward and ripped Delano's gun from his hand. The sheriff had fallen face forward, shot twice through the chest. "Clean him out," Slater called as Rip raced around to the front of the barn, Ross after him. The barn doors suddenly opened and a blue roan shot out with the rider spurring him unmercifully. He had a gun in his hand and he snapped a quick shot at Rip as he went by. It was Pharaoh Frank Casey. Rip took more careful aim, knocking his man from the saddle with a single shot just as he entered the alley. 2 other men had tried to follow Casey, but a dozen men were coming down the alley. The scared man held his gun in his hand. He grinned at Rip and Jack Ross holding him covered. Then his hands sagged a little. Rip said, "You might start by talking." The scared man shrugged. "I'm no man's fool," he observed. Rick Slater was still standing where he'd been hit, and Rip led him back. Ross had 15 men within. The cowboy grinned. "We saw you go in, Rip, but we didn't see you come out. I figured we better have a look." 2 of the miners had been bending over Pharaoh Frank's body. They came up now, one man shaking his head. "He's a dead man, mister," he explained. "You got him through the neck." "It's easier," Rip said, "than a rope. Maybe he's the lucky one." He took Slater by the arm and helped him back into the Alhambra, after ordering Ross to bring up a doctor. "I'm taking a look through Frank Casey's private rooms," he told Slater. "I might find something." Chapter 4. The meeting outside the Alhambra started at 8 o'clock that night. Bonfires had been lit at both ends of the street by the miners, and hundreds of them were congregating when Rip stepped out on the porch. Elsa Barkley stood behind him. The wounded Rick Slater was sitting in a chair on the porch. Ross and his 15 stalwarts from the other end of the hollow were grouped in front of Rip, guns in hand. "Tonight," Rip shouted, "the vigilantes are reborn, and the hangmen of Hitch Hollow die." The men of Hitch Hollow listened silently. Rip held a book in his hand which he'd taken from Frank Casey's safe. "I have here a list of the men who were in on the murders of Jeff Barkley and Niles Haygood, along with the hangings of a half-dozen other good men of this town. We have a signed confession made by one of the gang, indicating the ringleaders of this group." He stopped, noticing a slender, gray-haired man in black Prince Albert coat and shoestring tie. Harris Davis had arrived. Men stepped back, giving him room. "Serge Delano and Frank Casey are dead," Rip said. "We have taken 2 others prisoner. There are 15 more men in this gang, half of them over in Morgantown. One man ruled the Hangman's Society just as he ruled this town." "Name him," a miner roared. "We'll string him sky high." "This man gathered great wealth," Rip stated, "because he had agents buying up or annexing claims which were lost when the men holding them were hanged by the society." Jack Ross, standing directly beneath Rip, let out a short oath. "Look in the books at the recording office. The claim of every man who was hanged during the past year by the society is now registered under his name. He is the richest man in Hitch Hollow, and the rottenest inside." "Name him," a voice called again, this time more softly. "He has over 20 murders to his credit," Rip grated, "and he is standing in our midst right now." With his finger he pointed at Harris Davis. "There is the man. I have sufficient proof to hang him within the hour." The crowd around the slender old man broke away, leaving him standing alone in the circle. He'd had his arms crossed, and there was a small smile on his face as he uncrossed them. "He's got a gun," a man roared. Harris Davis lifted a small black derringer and pointed it at his temple. There was a muffled explosion, and the richest man in Hitch Hollow sank to the ground. Rip turned from the porch and went into the building, sickened by the sight. Elsa Barkley followed him. She touched his arm as he sank down in a chair at one of the empty card tables. "It wasn't a pleasant thing to do," the girl murmured, "but it was a duty." Rip looked at her. "I suppose you'll go back east," he said, "now that the trouble is over." Elsa Barkley shook her head. "I should like to work on your paper," she told him. "It is the only link I have to my father, and I think he would like it that way." "I would like it that way, too," Rip said simply. Looking at her he saw her face flush slightly, and he had an answer to the question in his eyes. It was the answer he wanted. More work by the author. "Can I send you Wrangler for free?" California toothpick. Bone orchard. Crowbait. Tin horn. Cowpoke. Beets dying. Out and out. Bangtail. Blue blazes. 5 beans in the wheel. Piebald. Pinto. Hogleg. Noose Fever. Pan out. Pack iron. Blood sign. Greenhorn. Tooth and nail noose. Boot hill bullyrag. All fired. Big old adios.